The morning unfolded quietly in a small southern town where nothing ever seemed urgent. The kind of place where weekdays drifted by unnoticed and neighbors measured time by routines rather than clocks. On one such ordinary morning, an elderly woman stood in her front yard, tending to the soil she had cared for longer than most people had lived in the town itself. She was known and respected, a gentle presence whose life had been defined by service, patience, and care for others, and there was nothing unusual or threatening about her actions as she worked calmly among her plants. The stillness was broken when a patrol car rolled to a stop nearby, carrying a young police officer whose confidence outweighed his experience and whose past complaints had been quietly buried to protect the badge he wore. To him, the woman was not a homeowner or a community fixture, but a problem to be tested, and what followed was framed as routine questioning, though it was rooted in assumption and bias rather than reason. His words were sharp and dismissive, his posture confrontational, and his questions carried an accusation that never needed evidence. The situation escalated quickly, not because of any danger, but because his authority felt challenged by her calm insistence that she belonged where she stood. Ego replaced judgment, and impatience turned into aggression as he stepped closer, raising his voice and asserting control for the sake of dominance rather than safety. Without provocation, he used physical force against her frail body, gripping her arm and jerking her off balance, an act wildly disproportionate to anything occurring in that quiet yard. When she stumbled and fell, the narrative was rewritten instantly, her pain reframed as defiance, her confusion labeled resistance. Charges were announced aloud as if saying them made them true: trespassing on her own property, resisting an arrest she never understood, assault against an officer who had initiated the violence. Neighbors who stepped outside in shock were silenced with threats and intimidation, warned to retreat or face consequences themselves, and fear did what it always does in such moments: it pushed witnesses back behind closed doors. Injured, humiliated, and bleeding, the woman was lifted not with care but with contempt, treated like a burden rather than a human being, and placed into the back of the patrol car as though her dignity no longer mattered. At the station, the tone only worsened as officers mocked her age, dismissed her injuries, and joked about her family, reducing her life to a punchline and her pain to an inconvenience. Requests for medical attention were ignored, her history erased, and she was processed like a hardened criminal rather than a senior citizen who needed help. The coldness of the cell matched the indifference of those responsible for her care, and the system closed ranks around the officer instead of questioning his actions. Yet amid the humiliation and fear, she held on to her composure, and when she finally spoke again, it was not with anger or desperation, but with calm clarity. She asked for one phone call, a simple request grounded in her rights, and though it was granted reluctantly and without concern, that single moment became the turning point, the quiet spark that would soon ignite a storm far beyond the walls of that small town station. The phone call did not go to a lawyer, a bail bondsman, or anyone connected to the small town justice system that believed it held complete control over her fate. Instead, her trembling fingers dialed a number that almost no civilian ever used, a secure line buried deep within layers of national defense infrastructure. To the officer nearby, half watching and half mocking, it sounded like nothing more than an old woman mumbling nonsense into a receiver, her words dismissed as confused rambling that posed no consequence. He leaned back, confident that whatever she was saying would change nothing. On the other end of the line, however, the voice that answered carried authority forged in secrecy, discipline, and command, a voice accustomed to making decisions that moved people and resources across continents. What began as concern sharpened instantly into something colder and far more dangerous, a calm so controlled it stripped the room of air even from hundreds of miles away. As the call ended, systems far beyond the town's awareness began to react, secure alerts flashing, communications rerouted, and flight paths quietly adjusted as federal mechanisms activated in silence. The local officers, still laughing and filing paperwork, remained completely unaware that they had crossed a line that did not exist on any map they understood. The first sign of collapse came when the police chief's private phone rang, the one reserved for emergencies he had never expected to face. The voice on the other end did not raise itself, yet every word carried weight enough to stop him cold, forcing him to sit as the reality was laid bare. The woman in the cell was not just an old detainee or a routine arrest gone wrong. She was the mother of a man who commanded forces trained to operate without hesitation or permission. Her son did not request cooperation, and the structures he represented did not negotiate with arrogance. Within minutes, power drained from the building, both literally and figuratively. Screens went dark, lines went silent, and the confidence that had filled the station moments earlier evaporated into panic. The sound that followed was unmistakable, heavy rotors cutting through the air as a military presence arrived without announcement or delay, turning the familiar parking lot into something unrecognizable. The abusive officer watched his authority disintegrate in real time as uniforms that outranked his entire worldview stepped through the doors, calm, precise, and utterly indifferent to his protests. There was no shouting, no chaos, only the swift removal of control from hands that had proven unworthy of it. The mother was released without spectacle or violence, freed not through rage but through absolute command. And as she was taken away to receive care, the consequences began to unfold behind her. Federal investigators moved in immediately, seizing records, securing evidence, and exposing layers of misconduct that had long been protected by silence. In the span of a single phone call, a system built on unchecked power began to collapse, and those who believed themselves untouchable learned how quickly authority disappears when it is challenged by something far greater. What followed was not a single reckoning, but a full unraveling, as investigators uncovered evidence that revealed a long-standing pattern of corruption rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Reports once buried were pulled into the light, body camera footage resurfaced, and altered records told a story of repeated abuse carried out under the protection of silence and routine approval. The officer at the center of it all soon realized that this case was no longer about one arrest, as federal charges stacked up rapidly, each more serious than the last, reaching far beyond the moment he had tried to explain away. The scrutiny did not stop with him, as the police chief was drawn into the investigation for enabling a culture that rewarded results over integrity and allowed misconduct to thrive unchecked. As details spread, public outrage ignited across the country, fueled by footage, testimony, and a growing refusal to accept excuses that had once been enough. The courtroom became the new stage of authority, replacing the false power of a badge with the weight of law, and the man who once commanded fear entered in restraints, stripped of uniform, confidence, and identity. Sentencing offered no comfort or leniency, only years behind concrete walls where time moved slowly and punishment arrived not in spectacle but in the relentless grind of consequence. While his world narrowed, the woman he had harmed began to heal, not only in body but in spirit, choosing to shape her future around purpose rather than vengeance. The settlement meant to compensate. Her pain was transformed into something far greater, redirected toward building protection for others who might otherwise face the same abuse alone. A community justice center rose in the very neighborhood where harm had occurred, offering legal support, advocacy, and hope where fear once lingered. In a turn no one expected, mercy extended even further as help was offered to the abuser's own mother, a quiet acknowledgement that cruelty does not define those left in its wake. The contrast between what was taken and what was given became impossible to ignore, exposing the emptiness of power used to dominate and the strength of compassion used to restore. In the end, the greatest punishment was not the prison sentence itself, but the erasure of relevance, the loss of voice, influence, and meaning. The story closed not with anger or triumph, but with dignity, accountability, and a change that endured long after the headlines faded.